My brother convinced our dying father to change his will, stealing my $2 million inheritance to build his luxury development empire. 5 years later, when I walked into his office as the bank president holding his foreclosure notice, the color drained from his face because he finally realized who really owned everything he thought was his. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sterile hospital smell still haunts me whenever I think about that October evening when everything fell apart. Dad had been fighting pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and we all knew the end was approaching faster than any of us wanted to acknowledge. I'd been there every single day after work, reading him articles from the business section, discussing his plans for Harper Family Vineyard, and listening to his stories about building the property from nothing into one of Oregon's most respected wineries. Ryan, my older brother by 3 years, had a different approach to Dad's illness. He visited sporadically, usually accompanied by his wife Victoria, and their conversations always seemed to center around practical matters rather than the emotional support Dad desperately needed. While I held Dad's hand through chemotherapy sessions, Ryan was busy networking at Portland real estate events, building what he called his future empire. That particular evening, I'd stayed late at my job as a junior associate at Morrison & Associates, a small law firm downtown, working on a complex property dispute case. When I finally arrived at the hospital around 8:30, Dad's room was dark except for the soft glow from the machines monitoring his vital signs. I assumed he was sleeping and considered returning in the morning, but something made me pause outside his door. Ryan's voice carried through the partially open doorway, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. Dad's responses were weak, barely audible, but I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. Ryan was discussing changes to the will, explaining why it made more sense for him to inherit the vineyard and the associated trust fund, rather than splitting everything equally between us as Dad had originally planned. The vineyard wasn't just a business to our family. Dad had purchased the land in the Willamette Valley 30 years earlier when it was considered a risky investment. Through decades of careful cultivation, strategic expansion, and building relationships with distributors nationwide, he'd transformed those initial 40 acres into a $2 million operation that supported not just our family but 12 full-time employees and their family. I pressed closer to the door, my heart pounding as I listened to Ryan's carefully constructed arguments. He painted me as someone too young and inexperienced to handle such a complex business operation. He emphasized his real estate background, his connections in the development community, and his vision for expanding the vineyard into a luxury resort destination. Most devastating of all, he suggested that Dad's legacy would be better preserved in his hands rather than mine. Dad's voice was barely a whisper when he responded, but I heard him express doubts about changing plans we'd discussed countless times during his illness. Ryan pressed harder, mentioning Victoria's pregnancy, their need for financial security, and his detailed business plan for maximizing the vineyard's potential. He made it sound as though keeping the current will would be a disservice to Dad's memory and a waste of everything he'd built. I wanted to storm into that room and confront Ryan immediately, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the shock of witnessing such calculated manipulation of our dying father, or maybe it was the realization that this conversation had probably been happening multiple times while I wasn't there to witness it. Instead, I retreated to the family waiting area, trying to process what I'd just heard while fighting back tears of rage and disbelief. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, hoping to speak with Dad privately about what Ryan had discussed. I found him awake but noticeably weaker than he'd been just days before. When I brought up the subject of his will and plans for the vineyard, Dad's response confused and alarmed me. He spoke vaguely about making sure his legacy was protected, about ensuring the vineyard would continue thriving under experienced leadership. When I asked directly if he was considering changes to his estate planning, Dad looked away from me for the first time in months. He mumbled something about Ryan having some interesting ideas and how important it was for the family business to remain strong. The conversation felt stilted, uncomfortable, completely different from our usual easy exchanges about his hopes for the future and his pride in what he'd accomplished. Over the following weeks, I noticed Ryan's visits becoming more frequent and longer in duration. He often arrived with legal documents, spreadsheets, and what appeared to be business proposals. When I tried to join these conversations, Ryan would find reasons to suggest I step out, claiming he didn't want to burden me with complicated financial discussions during such an emotional time. Dad's condition deteriorated rapidly in November. The doctors had initially estimated he might have 3 to 4 months remaining, but his body was failing faster than anyone anticipated. During what turned out to be his final week, Ryan practically lived at the hospital, constantly by Dad's side with a stream of visitors I didn't recognize. Later I learned these were attorneys, financial advisors, and real estate professionals Ryan had brought in to finalize the changes to Dad's estate. The funeral took place on a gray December morning, with rain that seemed appropriate for saying goodbye to a man who'd dedicated his life to nurturing things that grew from the earth. The service was beautiful, filled with stories from vineyard employees, local business owners, and family friends who'd watched Dad build something meaningful from nothing. Ryan delivered a moving eulogy about continuing Dad's legacy and ensuring the vineyard would thrive for generations to come. 3 days after the funeral, we met with Thomas Grant, the family attorney who'd handled Dad's legal affairs for over 20 years. I entered his office expecting to discuss the equal division of assets that Dad and I had talked about numerous times throughout his illness. Instead, Thomas presented a will dated just 2 weeks before Dad's death that transferred the entire vineyard operation, including the land, buildings, equipment, and $2 million trust fund, directly to Ryan. My section of the inheritance consisted of Dad's personal belongings, his vintage truck, and $25,000 from a separate savings account. The will specified that this arrangement would ensure the vineyard's continued success under experienced leadership, while providing me with enough resources to pursue my own career path without the burden of managing a complex agricultural business. I sat in that leather chair in Thomas's office, staring at legal documents that felt like they'd been written about someone else's family. The language was formal, clinical, reducing my relationship with Dad and my connection to the vineyard into a few paragraphs that essentially dismissed my entire future. Ryan sat across from me, attempting to look sympathetic while explaining how this arrangement was really for the best. He spoke about his plans to modernize the vineyard operations, his connections with high-end resort developers, and his vision for transforming the property into a destination that would honor Dad's memory while generating significantly more revenue. He mentioned the substantial mortgage payments, the equipment loans, and the complexity of managing seasonal employees as reasons why someone with my limited business experience might struggle to keep the operation profitable. Most painfully, Ryan suggested that Dad had realized I was better suited for a legal career than agricultural management. He claimed Dad had specifically mentioned wanting me to pursue my passion for law without being tied down by family business obligations. The will, according to Ryan, was Dad's way of giving me freedom while ensuring the vineyard remained in capable hands. I asked Thomas about the timing of these changes, questioning why Dad would have made such significant modifications so close to his death without discussing them with me. Thomas explained that terminal illness often prompted people to make final adjustments to their estate planning, ensuring their assets would be distributed in ways that maximized long-term benefits for all beneficiaries. When I pressed for more details about the conversations that led to these changes, Thomas became noticeably uncomfortable. He mentioned attorney-client privilege, the confidential nature of estate planning discussions, and his professional obligation to execute Dad's final wishes regardless of anyone's personal feelings about those decisions. Ryan's performance during that meeting was masterful. He expressed understanding about my disappointment while emphasizing his commitment to preserving Dad's legacy. He offered to keep me informed about major vineyard decisions and suggested that my legal background could be valuable for handling contracts and regulatory issues as the business expanded. The most devastating part wasn't losing the money, though $2 million would have transformed my life in ways I could barely imagine. What broke my heart was the feeling that Dad had lost faith in me during his final weeks, that Ryan had somehow convinced him I wasn't capable of continuing the work he'd dedicated his life to building. I left that attorney's office, feeling completely untethered from everything I'd believed about my family, my future, and my relationship with Dad. The vineyard had been more than just a business or an inheritance. It represented generations of family history, Dad's life's work, and what I'd always assumed would be my own legacy to continue and eventually pass on to my children. That evening, I drove out to the vineyard for what I assumed would be the last time as someone with any claim to the property. The winter vines looked dormant but not dead, waiting for spring to begin another cycle of growth. I walked through the tasting room where Dad had proudly served his wines to thousands of visitors over the years, remembering weekend afternoons, when he'd taught me about different grape varieties, fermentation processes, and the patience required to create something worth savoring. Ryan found me there around sunset, sitting on the deck overlooking the valley where Dad used to plan each season's planting strategy. He approached cautiously, probably unsure whether I was going to scream at him or break down crying. Instead, I felt eerily calm, as though I'd moved beyond anger into some deeper understanding of what had just happened to my life. He tried to explain his decision as though it had been purely business, emphasizing his qualifications and experience while downplaying what felt like a calculated theft. Ryan mentioned his mortgage payments, Victoria's pregnancy expenses, and his existing real estate investments as factors that made him better positioned to handle the financial complexities of vineyard ownership. When I asked him directly if he'd manipulated Dad into changing the will, Ryan's response was carefully crafted to avoid outright lies while refusing to acknowledge the truth. He claimed Dad had approached him about modifications, expressing concerns about my readiness to handle such responsibility. He insisted that every conversation had been focused on Dad's wishes rather than his own ambition. The most chilling moment came when Ryan offered me a job managing the vineyard's legal affairs, essentially proposing that I work for him on the property that should have been partially mine. He presented this as generous, an opportunity for me to remain connected to Dad's legacy while utilizing my legal training to support the business. I declined his offer with a calmness that surprised both of us. Instead, I told Ryan that I'd be leaving Portland within the month, pursuing opportunities that didn't involve watching him profit from what felt like an elaborate con game played on our dying father. I wished him luck with his plans and suggested he'd need it more than he realized. The weeks following that conversation were a blur of packing, resignation letters, and difficult conversations with friends who couldn't understand why I was leaving everything familiar behind. Most people assumed I was devastated by grief and making impulsive decisions during an emotional time. Few understood that staying in Portland meant watching Ryan transform Dad's life work into something completely different while pretending his inheritance had been legitimate. Claire Thompson, my closest friend from college, was the only person who truly grasped what had happened and why I needed to start over somewhere else. She helped me pack my belongings, drove with me to sell Dad's truck, and listened to me process the anger and disbelief that threatened to consume me during those final weeks in Oregon. The last time I saw the vineyard, Ryan was already meeting with contractors about expanding the tasting room and building what appeared to be guest accommodation. Signs advertised upcoming renovations that would transform the rustic charm Dad had carefully cultivated into something more commercial and tourist-focused. I didn't stop to say goodbye or watch the construction preparation. Instead, I pointed my car toward Interstate 84 and began driving east toward Denver, leaving behind everything I'd expected my life to become. During that long drive through the Columbia River Gorge and across the empty stretches of eastern Oregon, I had plenty of time to replay every conversation, every sign I'd missed, every moment when I should have realized what Ryan was planning. The anger came in waves, sometimes so intense I had to pull over and wait for it to pass, other times settling into a cold determination that felt more sustainable than rage. By the time I reached Denver 2 days later, I'd made several important decisions. I wouldn't spend the rest of my life fighting Ryan through expensive legal battles that would probably fail and definitely drain my limited resources. I wouldn't remain bitter about Dad's final choices, whether he'd made them freely or under Ryan's influence. Instead, I would use this betrayal as motivation to build something bigger than anything Ryan could imagine. Something that would prove his assessment of my capabilities had been completely wrong. I had $25,000, a law degree, 5 years of legal experience, and a burning desire to show my brother what real success looked like. It wasn't much of a foundation for rebuilding a life, but it was enough to begin. Denver represented possibility, anonymity, and the chance to become someone Ryan would never expect me to become. The first night in my budget motel room, looking out at the lights of an unfamiliar city, I made myself a promise that would drive everything I did for the next 5 years. I would return to Oregon eventually, not as the heartbroken sister who'd been cheated out of her inheritance, but as someone with the power to show Ryan exactly how much he'd underestimated me. That promise sustained me through the loneliness of starting over, the financial stress of building a career from nothing, and the moments when I questioned whether leaving everything behind had been the right choice. It would take 5 years to fulfill, but when I finally returned to Oregon, Ryan's face when he realized who I'd become would make every sacrifice worthwhile. Denver greeted me with a January snowstorm that seemed determined to test my resolve before I'd even unpacked my car. The budget motel where I'd planned to stay for a few days while apartment hunting became my home for 3 weeks, as I discovered that finding affordable housing in an unfamiliar city during winter was significantly more challenging than I'd anticipated. The classified ads in the Denver Post revealed a rental market that seemed designed to crush the dreams of anyone arriving with limited resources and no local references. Studio apartments in decent neighborhoods required first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposits, and credit checks that revealed my recent unemployment status. The places I could afford were either in neighborhoods that made me nervous to walk alone after dark, or had landlords who seemed more interested in collecting cash than maintaining basic habitability standards. My daily routine developed a desperate rhythm that probably would have depressed me if I'd allowed myself time for reflection. Mornings began with coffee from the motel's lobby machine, and scanning rental listings that had appeared overnight. I'd spend hours driving around Denver's various neighborhoods, learning the geography while visiting apartments that rarely matched their optimistic descriptions in the newspaper. Afternoons were dedicated to job hunting, a process that proved equally challenging in a city where I knew nobody and had no connections. My Oregon law license required reciprocity applications and additional examinations before I could practice in Colorado. The legal aid organizations I contacted were either fully staffed or operating with budgets that couldn't support hiring someone without local experience. Claire called every few days from Portland, providing updates about mutual friends and carefully avoiding any mention of Ryan or the vineyard unless I specifically asked. Her conversations became lifelines during those early weeks, when loneliness threatened to convince me that fleeing Oregon had been a catastrophic mistake rather than a necessary fresh start. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Miss Rodriguez, who managed the motel where I'd been staying, mentioned during one of our morning conversations that her daughter worked as a paralegal at a downtown law firm. She offered to make an introduction, explaining that the firm sometimes hired temporary workers to help with document review and case preparation during busy periods. Carmen Rodriguez turned out to be roughly my age, bilingual, and possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that comes from working your way through law school while supporting aging parents. We met for coffee at a small cafe near her office, where she explained the realities of Denver's legal job market, while sizing me up as a potential colleague. The firm where Carmen worked, Blackstone and Associates, specialized in real estate litigation and commercial disputes. They were currently drowning in paperwork from a massive class action lawsuit involving a failed condominium development. The work would be temporary, the pay modest, but it offered immediate income, and the possibility of demonstrating my capabilities to attorneys who might remember me when permanent positions opened up. Carmen introduced me to David Kim, a junior associate at Blackstone, who'd been tasked with managing the document review project. David was probably 30 years old, Korean American, wearing a suit that had seen better days, and sporting the kind of perpetual exhaustion that seemed endemic among young lawyers working for demanding firms. His interview questions focused more on my availability and willingness to work long hours than on my qualifications or career aspirations. The failed condominium project had generated thousands of documents that needed to be reviewed, categorized and analyzed for relevance to various legal claims. The work required attention to detail, basic understanding of real estate law, and the ability to sit in a windowless conference room for 10 hours a day without losing focus. I accepted the position immediately, grateful for any opportunity to begin earning money while establishing myself in Denver's legal community. The pay was $15 per hour, far less than I'd earned in Portland, but sufficient to transition from motel living to a modest apartment in a neighborhood that didn't require constant vigilance. The apartment I finally secured was a one-bedroom unit in a building that had probably been considered modern sometime during the Carter administration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The carpet showed stains from previous tenants. The kitchen appliances had the aesthetic appeal of medical equipment, and the heating system produced sounds that suggested mechanical distress. But it had reliable locks, reasonably clean bathrooms, and rent that consumed only 60% of my anticipated income rather than the 80% demanded by nicer places. My first day at Blackstone & Associates introduced me to the unglamorous reality of legal work that law school had somehow failed to adequately prepare me for. The conference room where I'd be working contained 6 folding tables, fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly, and bankers' boxes stacked from floor to ceiling along every wall. David explained the document coding system, showed me the computer database where I'd log my findings, and wished me luck before disappearing to handle what he described as a deposition emergency. The documents told the story of a real estate development that had promised luxury living at affordable prices, but delivered structural problems, cost overruns, and contractor disputes that left buyers with uninhabitable units and massive financial losses. Reading through correspondence between developers, contractors, and investors revealed patterns of deception, corner-cutting, and blame-shifting that made my situation with Ryan seem almost quaint by comparison. Carmen checked on me periodically throughout that first week, offering encouragement and practical advice about navigating Blackstone's office politics. She explained which attorneys were worth impressing, which partners had reputations for mentoring promising junior staff, and which coffee shops near the office served food that wouldn't bankrupt someone earning paralegal wages. The work itself was mind-numbing but oddly therapeutic. Each document required careful reading, analysis of its relevance to various legal claims, and precise data entry that left no room for dwelling on personal grievances or self-pity. My legal training made the process faster than it might have been for someone without my background, and I found myself completing daily quotas ahead of schedule, while maintaining accuracy rates that impressed David. After 2 weeks of proving my competence with document review, David began asking for my input on legal research questions that arose from the materials I'd been analyzing. His questions suggested that he'd been watching my work more carefully than I'd realized, and had developed confidence in my analytical ability. The conversations that developed during these research collaborations revealed that David's background included real estate law, commercial lending, and property development issues. He'd graduated from University of Colorado Law School 3 years earlier, and joined Blackstone specifically because of their reputation for complex real estate litigation. David's personal story emerged gradually through lunch conversations and late evening discussions, while we worked past normal business hours. His parents had immigrated from South Korea when he was young, investing their life savings in a small restaurant that became successful enough to support their family, while putting David through college and law school. His decision to specialize in real estate law had been motivated partly by witnessing his parents' struggles with commercial leases, zoning regulations, and property tax disputes that could have destroyed their business if handled incorrectly. The class action lawsuit we were working on represented hundreds of families who'd been deceived by developers promising affordable homeownership, but delivering financial ruin instead. David's commitment to the case went beyond professional obligation. He understood what it meant to work toward building something valuable only to have it threatened by people with more resources and fewer scruples. My temporary position at Blackstone was scheduled to end when the document review phase of the lawsuit concluded, probably sometime in late spring. David mentioned this deadline frequently, encouraging me to network with other attorneys and submit applications for permanent positions before the temporary work disappeared. Instead of following his advice immediately, I found myself becoming increasingly invested in understanding the failed condominium development from a business perspective, rather than just a legal one. The documents revealed not just what had gone wrong, but patterns of decision-making that could have prevented the disaster if anyone had been paying attention to warning signs, rather than focusing exclusively on profit projection. During my lunch breaks, I began visiting the actual condominium site where the litigation had originated. The development consisted of 4 buildings in various stages of completion, surrounded by construction equipment that had been abandoned when funding disappeared. Walking through the partially finished units revealed the gap between marketing promises and construction reality that had prompted the lawsuit. The original marketing materials, which I'd reviewed extensively during document analysis, had promoted luxury amenities, high-end finishes, and energy-efficient systems that would make homeownership affordable through reduced utility costs. The reality involved cheap materials, inadequate insulation, and mechanical systems that had failed repeatedly during the brief period when any units had been occupied. My fascination with the project's failure probably should have remained academic, but something about the site sparked ideas that had nothing to do with the legal case. The location was excellent, positioned between downtown Denver and several growing suburban communities. The basic building structures, despite their problems, had been designed with reasonable layouts that could be attractive to buyers if properly completed. One afternoon while exploring the abandoned buildings, I encountered Robert Chen, an older Asian man wearing expensive casual clothes and taking photographs of the construction. He noticed me studying the architectural plans posted in the sales office and struck up a conversation about the development's potential despite its obvious problems. Robert introduced himself as a real estate investor who specialized in distressed properties and troubled development. He'd been watching the lawsuit's progress, waiting for resolution that would allow him to potentially acquire the property at a significant discount and complete the construction with proper financing and competent contractor. Our conversation revealed that Robert had immigrated from Taiwan 30 years earlier with a background in engineering and a small amount of capital that he'd gradually built into a portfolio of successful real estate investment. His approach involved identifying properties with good fundamentals that had been damaged by poor management, inadequate financing, or contractor problems that could be solved with proper oversight and sufficient resources. Robert's questions about my presence at the site led to a discussion of my work on the legal case and my background in law. When he learned about my recent arrival in Denver and my interest in real estate issues, he offered insights about the local market that weren't available through casual research or newspaper articles. The Denver real estate market was experiencing significant growth driven by technology companies relocating from more expensive coastal cities, young professionals seeking affordable alternatives to California and New York, and retirees attracted by outdoor recreation opportunities and relatively low cost of living. This growth created opportunities for investors who understood which neighborhoods were positioned for appreciation and which types of properties would attract the incoming demographic. Robert's investment strategy focused on residential properties in transitional neighborhoods where infrastructure improvements and demographic changes were creating value that hadn't yet been reflected in property prices. He bought distressed properties, renovated them to high standards, and either sold them to owner-occupants or held them as rental properties that generated steady income while appreciating over time. During our conversation, Robert mentioned that he occasionally partnered with attorneys who understood real estate law and could help navigate the regulatory issues that complicated property development in Denver. His current attorney was approaching retirement, and he'd been considering relationships with younger legal professionals who might grow with his business over time. The suggestion wasn't quite a job offer, but it represented possibilities that my temporary position at Blackstone couldn't provide. Robert gave me his business card and suggested I call him if I was interested in learning more about real estate investment from a practical rather than purely legal perspective. That evening, I researched Robert's background through public records and newspaper articles. His business, Chen Development Group, had been involved in dozens of successful projects throughout the Denver metropolitan area. The company's reputation appeared solid, with no significant legal disputes or regulatory problems that might indicate questionable business practice. David noticed my distraction during the following week's work at Blackstone. When I mentioned my conversation with Robert and the possibility of transitioning from litigation support to real estate investment, his response surprised me with its enthusiasm rather than concern about losing a productive team member. David explained that real estate investment offered opportunities for legal professionals that traditional law firm practice couldn't match. Working directly with investors and developers provided exposure to deal-making, financing, and business strategy that went far beyond the document review and research tasks that constituted most junior attorney positions. He also mentioned that Blackstone occasionally partnered with investment groups on projects that required both legal expertise and development experience. If I developed relationships in the investment community while maintaining connections at the firm, future collaborations, might benefit everyone involved. The possibility of calling Robert felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying. My experience with real estate was limited to the legal issues I'd encountered through my work, plus whatever insights I'd gained from growing up around Dad's vineyard business. But Robert had seemed genuinely interested in my potential rather than my current qualifications, and his investment approach appeared methodical rather than speculative. Carmen's advice when I asked for her opinion was characteristically practical. She suggested meeting with Robert to learn more about his business without committing to anything permanent. The worst outcome would be gaining knowledge about real estate investment that could inform my legal career. The best outcome might be discovering opportunities that wouldn't exist within traditional law firm hierarchy. My call to Robert resulted in an invitation to lunch at a restaurant near downtown Denver, where he explained his current projects and his need for legal support that went beyond what his retiring attorney could provide. Robert's business model involved identifying undervalued properties, securing financing for renovation or development, managing construction projects, and either selling completed properties or holding them for long-term appreciation. The legal work supporting these activities included contract negotiation, due diligence review, regulatory compliance, and dispute resolution when problems arose with contractors, lenders, or municipal authorities. Robert needed someone who could handle these responsibilities while also understanding the business implications of legal decisions, rather than just their technical correctness. Robert's offer was structured as a consulting arrangement rather than traditional employment. I would continue my work at Blackstone until the document review project concluded, then transition to supporting his projects on a contract basis. The arrangement would provide steady income while allowing me to learn the real estate business from someone with proven expertise. The financial terms were competitive with what I might expect from a junior associate position at a Denver law firm, but with significantly more autonomy and exposure to business decision-making. Robert also mentioned that successful collaboration might lead to equity participation in future projects, creating wealth-building opportunities that traditional legal employment couldn't offer. My decision to accept Robert's proposal represented the first major step toward building something that belonged entirely to me rather than working to advance someone else's vision. The consulting arrangement would begin in May, giving me 3 months to complete my work at Blackstone while preparing for a transition that felt simultaneously logical and completely unprecedented. Claire's reaction when I described the opportunity revealed both excitement about my apparent recovery from the inheritance disaster and concern about my willingness to take risks that might not work out as planned. She reminded me that I'd been in Denver for only 3 months and suggested that rushing into unconventional career choices might reflect emotional decision-making rather than careful planning. Her concerns were reasonable, but they underestimated how much I'd changed since leaving Oregon. The woman who'd driven away from the vineyard in January had been devastated by betrayal and uncertain about her ability to rebuild her life independently. The woman considering Robert's offer in April had spent 3 months proving to herself that she could succeed in an unfamiliar environment without depending on family connections or inherited advantage. The remaining weeks at Blackstone passed quickly as I focused on completing the document review project while researching real estate investment strategies and Denver market conditions. David's enthusiasm about my transition to real estate work led to several conversations about potential future collaborations between Blackstone and Robert's development project. The class action lawsuit was progressing towards settlement negotiations that would probably resolve the case without trial. The document review had uncovered sufficient evidence of developer misconduct to support substantial damage claims, while the developers faced financial constraints that made prolonged litigation impractical for their defense. My final day at Blackstone included a small celebration organized by Carmen and attended by several attorneys who'd worked with me during the document review project. David presented me with a business card holder engraved with my name and the inscription "Future Real Estate Mogul," a joke that felt more like prophecy than humor. Robert's office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that exemplified the kind of transitional area where he focused his investment. The building itself had been renovated from industrial space into modern offices and loft apartments, demonstrating the transformation potential that drove his business model. My first week working with Robert involved reviewing contracts for 3 different projects in various stages of development. The work required analysis of construction agreements, financing terms, and municipal permit requirements that were more complex than anything I'd encountered during my legal training. Robert's teaching approach combined practical instruction with immediate application. He'd explain the business reasoning behind specific contract terms, then ask me to draft similar provisions for other projects. His feedback focused on achieving objectives rather than demonstrating legal knowledge, emphasizing the importance of understanding what clients needed rather than simply showing them what lawyers knew. The pace of learning was intense but exhilarating. Each project presented unique challenges that required creative problem-solving rather than reliance on standard legal procedures. Robert's confidence in my ability to handle increasing responsibility made me feel capable of accomplishments I'd never previously imagined. By summer's end, I was managing legal aspects of 4 concurrent projects while helping Robert evaluate potential new investments throughout the Denver metropolitan area. The work had evolved from providing legal support to participating in business strategy discussions that would determine which properties to pursue and how to structure deals that maximized returns while minimizing risk. My income from the consulting arrangement had exceeded my expectations, allowing me to move from my dingy apartment to a much nicer place in a neighborhood where I felt comfortable walking alone after dark. More importantly, I was building expertise and professional relationships that represented genuine career advancement, rather than just employment. The transformation felt almost surreal when I compared my current situation to the despair I'd experienced during those first weeks in Denver. Ryan's betrayal had forced me to discover capabilities I might never have developed if I'd remained in Oregon managing Dad's vineyard according to plans we'd made before I knew what I was actually capable of achieving. Robert began discussing the possibility of forming a more permanent partnership as autumn approached. His retirement timeline had accelerated due to health concerns, and he needed someone capable of managing ongoing projects while developing new investment opportunities. The conversation represented a chance to become an equity partner in a successful business rather than remaining an employee providing services to someone else's enterprise. The partnership proposal would require substantial financial investment on my part, money I didn't currently possess but could potentially borrow against future earnings, and Robert's willingness to guarantee loans secured by the business asset. The risk was significant, but so was the potential for building wealth that could exceed anything Dad's vineyard might have provided. My decision to pursue the partnership marked the end of my recovery period, and the beginning of a new phase focused on building something substantial enough to eventually return to Oregon from a position of strength rather than merely surviving the aftermath of Ryan's betrayal. The partnership agreement with Robert took 6 months to negotiate, not because either of us harbored doubts about the arrangement, but because creating a fair structure for transferring ownership of an established business to someone with more ambition than capital required careful planning. Robert's attorney, the same Thomas Fitzgerald who'd been preparing for retirement, emerged from semi-retirement to craft documents that would protect both of our interests while allowing for a transition that could span several years. The financial structure we developed was more creative than anything I'd encountered during my legal training. Rather than requiring me to purchase half of Robert's business immediately, the partnership agreement established a performance-based acquisition plan. I would begin with a 25% ownership stake acquired through a combination of promissory notes and sweat equity. Additional ownership percentages could be earned through achieving specific revenue and profit targets over the following 5 years. Robert retained majority control initially but committed to transferring operational authority to me within 18 months. His role would transition from active management to advisory oversight, allowing him to reduce his daily involvement while ensuring the business maintained its reputation for quality and reliability. The arrangement gave me immediate equity in a profitable enterprise while providing Robert with confidence that his life's work would continue thriving under new leadership. The promissory notes required for my initial investment represented more debt than I'd ever imagined taking on, but Robert's willingness to personally guarantee the loans made financing possible through Denver Community Bank, a local institution that specialized in supporting small business development. The bank president, Margaret Wolf, had worked with Robert on previous projects and understood the track record that made our partnership a reasonable risk despite my limited credit history. My first year as Robert's partner coincided with Denver's emergence as a major destination for technology companies seeking alternatives to Silicon Valley's escalating costs. Companies like Google, Amazon and Microsoft were establishing significant operations in the Denver metropolitan area, bringing thousands of high-paying jobs that created unprecedented demand for quality housing within reasonable commuting distance of their facility. Robert's experience proved invaluable for identifying investment opportunities before they became obvious to other investors. He taught me to recognize neighborhood transition patterns, infrastructure improvements that would drive property values, and demographic shifts that created demand for specific types of housing. His methodology combined financial analysis with intuitive understanding of how cities evolve over time. Our first major project under the partnership involved acquiring a cluster of dilapidated apartment buildings in the Five Points neighborhood, an area that had struggled with economic decline for decades, but was positioned for revitalization due to its proximity to downtown and emerging technology corridors. The buildings required substantial renovation, but their solid construction and attractive architectural details made them ideal candidates for transformation into modern housing that would appeal to young professionals. The acquisition process tested every skill I'd developed during my transition from legal practice to real estate investment. Negotiating with multiple property owners required patience and creativity, as each building's sale depended on completing deals for the adjacent properties that would make comprehensive redevelopment feasible. Securing renovation financing involved presentations to lenders who needed convincing that our renovation budget estimates were realistic and our projected rental rates achievable. Robert's reputation opened doors that would have remained closed to someone with my limited experience, but the actual negotiations required me to demonstrate competence rather than relying on his credibility. Lenders, contractors, and municipal officials quickly learned to direct their questions to me rather than assuming Robert would handle all substantive decisions. The renovation work began in spring and continued through the following winter, a process that educated me about construction management, cost control, and the countless details that determine whether property development generates profits or loss. Robert insisted that I spend time on construction sites, learning to identify quality workmanship and understanding how building systems function together to create environments that tenants would find desirable. The contractors we hired came from Robert's network of relationships built over 30 years of successful projects. Their willingness to work with us reflected confidence in Robert's business practices, but they gradually developed direct working relationships with me as they realized I was learning their trades rather than just managing schedules and budgets. Marcus Webb, the electrical contractor who handled our renovation work, became an unexpected mentor in understanding how buildings actually function. His background included both residential and commercial projects, giving him insights about electrical systems, energy efficiency, and technology infrastructure that proved valuable for creating properties that would attract tenants willing to pay premium rents. Marcus had started his contracting business 20 years earlier after completing an apprenticeship program and saving enough money to purchase basic equipment. His company had grown steadily by focusing on quality work rather than competing solely on price, building relationships with developers who valued reliability more than low bids. Our discussions during construction visits evolved into broader conversations about real estate development, business strategy, and the opportunities created by Denver's rapid growth. Marcus understood construction costs, labor markets, and regulatory requirements from a perspective that complemented Robert's investor viewpoint and my legal background. The Five Points renovation project exceeded our projected timelines and budgets, as most construction projects do, but the final results validated Robert's vision for the neighborhood's potential. The apartments attracted young professionals working in downtown Denver and the emerging tech corridor, generating rental income that justified our investment, while proving that similar projects could be profitable throughout the area. Our success with 5 Points led to opportunities for additional projects in surrounding neighborhoods where property values hadn't yet reflected the area's improving prospects. Robert's methodology involved acquiring properties systematically rather than opportunistically, building a portfolio that would benefit from coordinated improvements rather than isolated renovation. The second year of our partnership brought challenges that tested my ability to manage multiple projects simultaneously, while maintaining the attention to detail that made our renovations successful. We were overseeing construction at 6 different properties while evaluating potential acquisitions for future development, and managing rental operations for completed projects. Robert's health concerns, which he'd mentioned casually when proposing our partnership, became more serious during this period. His doctor had diagnosed early-stage heart disease that required lifestyle changes and reduced stress level. The timing couldn't have been worse from a business perspective, but it forced me to assume full operational responsibility sooner than either of us had anticipated. The transition felt overwhelming initially, but I discovered that 18 months of working closely with Robert had prepared me more thoroughly than I'd realized. His teaching approach had emphasized understanding principles rather than memorizing procedures, enabling me to apply his methodology to situations we hadn't specifically discussed. My relationship with Margaret Wolf at Denver Community Bank deepened as I took over primary responsibility for managing our financing relationship. Margaret had watched my development during the partnership's early months and expressed confidence in my ability to maintain Robert's standards while bringing fresh perspectives to the business. The bank's willingness to extend our credit lines for additional acquisitions reflected their assessment of our track record, but also Margaret's personal belief that I understood both the opportunities and risks involved in real estate development. Her support became crucial when we identified a much larger project that would require financing beyond anything we'd previously attempted. The opportunity involved a failed retail development in Stapleton, the former airport site that Denver was transforming into a massive mixed-use community. The original developer had completed construction of a shopping center, but failed to attract sufficient tenants to make the project financially viable. The property was entering foreclosure, creating a chance to acquire a substantial commercial asset at a significant discount. Robert's analysis of the Stapleton opportunity revealed potential that the original developer had failed to realize. The shopping center's location was excellent, positioned at the intersection of major transportation corridors that would eventually connect to downtown Denver and Denver International Airport. The buildings were well constructed but designed for large anchor tenants, rather than the smaller businesses that would more likely succeed in an emerging community. Converting the shopping center into a mixed-use development with smaller retail spaces, office suites, and residential units would require substantial additional investment, but could create a property worth several times our acquisition cost. The project represented exactly the kind of transformation that had built Robert's reputation, but on a scale that would test all of our capabilities. The foreclosure auction for the Stapleton property was scheduled for November, giving us 3 months to arrange financing and develop renovation plans that would convince lenders to support our acquisition. The required investment would exhaust our available credit and commit us to a project that would dominate our attention for at least 2 years. Robert's enthusiasm for the Stapleton project was tempered by realistic assessment of the challenges involved. The renovation would require permits and approvals from multiple municipal agencies, coordination with Stapleton's master development plan, and marketing to tenant categories we'd never previously targeted. Failure would probably bankrupt our business, while success could establish us as major players in Denver's development community. My decision to pursue the Stapleton acquisition reflected confidence that had been building throughout our partnership. The projects we'd completed had consistently exceeded our financial projections while establishing relationships with contractors, lenders, and municipal officials who could support more ambitious ventures. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my judgment about opportunities that others might consider too risky or complex. The financing package for Stapleton required contributions from 3 different lenders, each covering specific aspects of the acquisition and renovation. Denver Community Bank provided our primary construction loan, while a regional commercial lender covered the property acquisition and a private investment group supplied additional equity capital in exchange for a percentage of future profit. Assembling the financing consortium took 2 months of presentations, negotiations, and due diligence reviews that tested my ability to explain complex investment strategies to people with different risk tolerances and return requirements. The process educated me about sophisticated financing techniques that would prove valuable for future projects requiring substantial capital. The foreclosure auction itself was anticlimactic compared to the months of preparation that preceded. We faced competition from 2 other development groups, but our financing was already confirmed while theirs appeared contingent on post-auction approval. Our winning bid was 40% below the property's original construction cost, providing immediate equity that justified the risks we were assuming. Robert's pride in my performance during the Stapleton acquisition was evident during our celebration dinner that evening. He expressed amazement at how quickly I'd mastered skills that had taken him decades to develop, attributing my rapid progress to the combination of legal training and intuitive understanding of business dynamics. The Stapleton renovation began immediately after closing, with Marcus Webb's electrical company serving as our primary contractor for the complex conversion work required to transform retail spaces into mixed-use facilities. The project's scale required subcontractors, specializing in everything from commercial plumbing to fiber optic networking, creating a construction management challenge unlike anything we'd previously undertaken. Robert's involvement during the early months of construction was limited by his health concerns, but his advice remained invaluable for navigating problems that arose weekly during the complex renovation. His experience prevented several costly mistakes that could have derailed the project's timeline or budget. The marketing strategy for Stapleton required understanding tenant categories we'd never previously recruited. Rather than seeking traditional retail chains that might expect long-term leases at below-market rates, we focused on technology companies, creative businesses and professional services firms that valued modern facilities and flexible lease terms more than absolute lowest cost. David Kim's assistance proved crucial for developing lease agreements that would attract desirable tenants while protecting our interests if the mixed-use concept failed to achieve projected occupancy rates. His legal expertise had evolved during his continued employment at Blackstone and Associates, where he'd gained experience with commercial leasing and development projects. Our friendship had continued despite our different career paths, with periodic dinners where we shared updates about our respective professional development. David's enthusiasm about my transition from legal practice to real estate development reflected his own dissatisfaction with traditional law firm employment and his interest in more entrepreneurial opportunity. The first tenants for our converted Stapleton spaces included a software development company relocating from California, a marketing agency seeking modern facilities, and a medical practice specializing in sports medicine. Their lease commitments validated our conversion strategy while generating cash flow that supported continued renovation work on unleased portions of the property. Robert's recovery from his heart surgery progressed steadily throughout the renovation period, but his doctor's recommendations for reduced stress and limited travel meant that I was handling most client interactions and project management responsibility. The transition felt natural rather than burdensome, reflecting how thoroughly I'd absorbed his approach to business development. The Stapleton project's success exceeded our most optimistic projections, achieving 90% occupancy within 6 months of completion and generating rental income that justified valuations well above our total investment. The property's performance attracted attention from commercial real estate brokers and other developers who began approaching us about partnership opportunities for similar projects. Regional and national real estate publications featured articles about our Stapleton conversion, describing it as an innovative example of adaptive reuse that created value while serving community development objectives. The recognition established credibility that opened doors to larger projects and more sophisticated financing sources. Margaret Wolf's recommendation led to conversations with other banking institutions that specialized in commercial real estate development. Their interest in our business reflected both our demonstrated track record and the banking industry's recognition that Denver's growth would continue creating opportunities for experienced developers. Robert's decision to accelerate his retirement timeline was prompted partly by his health concerns, but also by his confidence that I could manage the business independently while maintaining the quality standards that had built his reputation. The partnership agreement's performance targets had been exceeded ahead of schedule, qualifying me for additional ownership percentages that would make me the majority partner within another year. The formal transition ceremony at Denver Community Bank included Margaret Wolf, Thomas Fitzgerald, and several contractors who'd worked with Robert throughout his career. Robert's speech about passing his business to someone who understood both its financial and social responsibilities moved me more than I'd expected, particularly his comment about my development from someone fleeing family disappointment to someone building legacies for others. My acceptance speech was brief, acknowledging Robert's mentorship while committing to maintaining his standards for quality development that benefited communities rather than just generating profit. The commitment felt personally meaningful given my experiences with Ryan's approach to Dad's Vineyard, where short-term financial gains had taken precedence over preserving something valuable for future generations. The business credit lines now established in my name represented borrowing capacity that exceeded Dad's entire vineyard operation by substantial margin. The realization that I'd built financial resources that dwarfed the inheritance Ryan had stolen provided satisfaction that was more profound than simple revenge fantasies could have delivered. Robert's transition to advisory status coincided with our expansion into commercial lending, a natural evolution that leveraged our development experience while generating income from projects we weren't directly managing. The lending business connected us with developers throughout Colorado and neighboring states, creating opportunities to participate in larger projects while diversifying our revenue sources. The commercial lending operation required additional staff, starting with Carmen Rodriguez, who left Blackstone and Associates to manage our loan administration and client relationship. Her bilingual capabilities and paralegal experience made her invaluable for serving clients whose primary language was Spanish and for managing the complex documentation required for commercial loans. David Kim's decision to leave Blackstone and join our expanding business reflected his frustration with law firm politics and his interest in more entrepreneurial work. His addition provided legal expertise that supported both our development projects and our lending operations, while positioning us to handle larger transactions that required sophisticated legal structure. The team we'd assembled by the end of my third year in Denver included expertise in development, construction management, commercial lending, and legal compliance. Our office had expanded from Robert's original converted warehouse space to occupy an entire floor of a modern building in downtown Denver's financial district. The business transformation from Robert's one-man operation to a diversified real estate company employing 12 people felt surreal when I compared it to my arrival in Denver with $25,000 and no connection. The growth had been methodical rather than speculative, building capabilities that supported increasingly ambitious projects while maintaining conservative financial management. Our reputation for quality development and reliable lending had attracted attention from institutional investors seeking partners for projects throughout the Rocky Mountain region. These relationships provided access to capital that could support acquisitions we couldn't finance independently while offering opportunities to learn from developers with national experience. The fourth year brought our first out-of-state project, a mixed-use development in Boulder that combined retail, office, and residential space in a format similar to our successful Stapleton conversion. The project's complexity required coordination with Colorado environmental regulations, municipal planning requirements, and neighborhood organizations concerned about development impact. Successfully completing the Boulder project established our credibility beyond Denver's metropolitan area, while generating profits that supported further expansion of our lending operation. The combination of development expertise and commercial lending created synergies that distinguished our business from competitors who focused exclusively on one aspect of real estate finance. Margaret Wolf's retirement from Denver Community Bank led to my appointment to the bank's board of directors, a position that provided insights about banking operations, while expanding my professional network throughout Colorado's business community. The appointment reflected recognition of our company's growth and my personal development from struggling newcomer to established business leader. The fifth year of operations brought opportunities to participate in projects that would have been impossible to imagine when I'd first arrived in Denver. Our development portfolio included over 200 residential units, 50,000 square feet of commercial space, and lending relationships with developers in 6 western states. The business valuation conducted for insurance purposes estimated our company's worth at $12 million, representing growth that exceeded the inheritance I'd lost by a factor of 6. The comparison to Dad's Vineyard wasn't entirely fair, since real estate development generated different returns than agricultural operations, but the financial success provided vindication that was deeply satisfying. Robert's pride in our business growth was evident during our quarterly meetings, where he reviewed financial reports and strategic plans. His health had stabilized, allowing him to travel occasionally and maintain relationships with longtime clients who valued his continued involvement even though I'd assumed operational control. The question of returning to Oregon had been evolving in my mind throughout the business's rapid growth. My original motivation for leaving had been healing from Ryan's betrayal, but my objective had shifted toward building something substantial enough to demonstrate my capabilities to anyone who'd underestimated them. The opportunity to return emerged unexpectedly through a phone call from Thomas Grant, the Portland attorney who'd administered Dad's estate. Thomas had been monitoring Oregon's banking industry and noticed reports about our company's expansion into commercial lending. His call included condolences for not contacting me sooner, and an invitation to discuss opportunities that might interest someone with my expertise. Thomas explained that Oregon's economic growth, driven largely by technology companies relocating from California, had created demand for commercial real estate development and lending services that local institutions couldn't fully satisfy. Several banks were seeking partnerships with experienced out-of-state companies that could provide capital and expertise for larger projects. Pacific Northwest Bank, headquartered in Portland, was particularly interested in establishing relationships with commercial lenders who understood both real estate development and technology industry requirements. The bank's president, Jennifer Walsh, had specifically requested introductions to companies with track records similar to ours. Thomas's invitation to meet with Pacific Northwest Bank represented exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping would eventually emerge. The timing felt perfect, coinciding with our business's maturity and my confidence that we could expand successfully into new markets without jeopardizing our Colorado operation. My decision to accept Thomas's invitation marked the beginning of a process that would eventually bring me back to Oregon from a position of strength, rather than as someone seeking refuge from family disappointment. The meeting with Jennifer Walsh would determine whether returning to my home state represented a viable business opportunity or merely wishful thinking about possibilities that didn't actually exist. The flight from Denver to Portland in late October felt like traveling backward through time, watching the Rocky Mountains give way to familiar forests and valleys that had shaped my childhood. 5 years had passed since I'd driven away from Oregon with nothing but determination and a battered suitcase, yet the landscape looked unchanged, as though my absence had been merely a long weekend rather than a complete life transformation. Jennifer Walsh met me at Portland International Airport, a gesture that immediately signaled the seriousness of Pacific Northwest Bank's interest in establishing a partnership with our company. Jennifer was probably 50 years old, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that suggested both professionalism and the kind of personal attention to detail that successful banking executives cultivate. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine, and her first question was about my flight rather than business matters. During the drive from the airport to downtown Portland, Jennifer provided a comprehensive overview of Oregon's economic landscape that had evolved dramatically during my absence. Technology companies had indeed been relocating from California in significant numbers, drawn by lower operating costs, skilled workforce availability, and quality of life factors that made employee recruitment easier. The growth had created demand for commercial real estate that exceeded local developers' capacity to supply. Portland's downtown core was experiencing renaissance driven by companies like Nike expanding their presence, Intel increasing their local workforce, and numerous startups choosing Oregon over more expensive alternatives. The residential market had responded with price increases that were pricing out longtime residents, creating political pressure for affordable housing development that required innovative financing solutions. Pacific Northwest Bank had been serving Oregon communities for over 60 years, building relationships with local businesses, while maintaining conservative lending practices that had helped them weather economic downturns that had damaged competitors. Their current challenge involved balancing community banking traditions with opportunities created by rapid economic growth. Jennifer's personal background included 20 years in commercial banking, starting as a loan officer and advancing through positions that had given her experience with real estate development, business lending, and regulatory compliance. Her appointment as bank president 3 years earlier had coincided with the board's recognition that Oregon's growth required more sophisticated approaches to commercial lending. The bank's board of directors included several prominent Oregon business leaders who understood that partnering with experienced out-of-state developers could provide capabilities that would take years to develop internally. Their interest in our company reflected careful research about our track record and growth trajectory rather than desperation for any available partnership. Our initial initial meeting took place in Pacific Northwest Bank's boardroom, a space that managed to feel both professional and welcoming with its combination of modern furniture and artwork featuring Oregon landscape. The bank's senior management team included Jennifer, the chief lending officer, the head of commercial banking, and the chairman of the board, who'd specifically requested to participate in our discussion. My presentation about our company's development focused on the methodical approach we'd taken to building expertise, the conservative financial management that had sustained growth without endangering our stability, and the team we'd assembled to support expansion into new markets. I emphasized our track record of completing projects on time and within budget while maintaining quality standards that attracted premium tenants and generated strong returns. The bank's questions revealed thorough preparation and genuine understanding of both our business model and the challenges involved in expanding into Oregon's regulatory environment. They'd researched our Colorado projects, spoken with references including Margaret Wolf, and analyzed our financial statements with the kind of attention that suggested serious interest rather than casual exploration. Jennifer's questions about my personal background were carefully phrased to respect privacy, while understanding my connections to Oregon and motivations for considering expansion into the state. I provided general information about growing up in the Willamette Valley and my legal education without mentioning the family circumstances that had driven me to Colorado. The meeting concluded with an invitation to tour several properties that Pacific Northwest Bank had identified as potential development opportunities. Jennifer suggested that seeing the actual projects would provide better understanding of Oregon's market conditions than any amount of theoretical discussion could achieve. Our property tours began with a failed shopping center in Beaverton that bore striking similarities to the Stapleton project we'd successfully converted in Denver. The retail spaces had been designed for large anchor tenants who'd either relocated or gone out of business, leaving a well-constructed but obsolete building in an area experiencing residential growth. The property's location near several technology companies made it an excellent candidate for mixed-use conversion, particularly given the shortage of quality office space that could accommodate smaller businesses. The acquisition price would be reasonable, renovation costs manageable, and the tenant market appeared strong enough to support premium rental rates. Jennifer's analysis of the Beaverton property demonstrated sophisticated understanding of real estate development that exceeded what I'd expected from a traditional community bank. Her questions about construction costs, permitting requirements, and marketing strategies revealed knowledge that could only come from extensive experience with similar projects. The second property was a residential development in Lake Oswego that had been started by a developer who'd run out of capital before completing construction. The partially built homes were in an excellent location with strong schools and convenient access to Portland's job centers, making them attractive to the technology workers who were driving demand for quality housing. Completing the Lake Oswego project would require different expertise than our typical renovations, but the fundamentals appeared sound and the potential returns attractive. The original developer had obtained all necessary permits and completed foundation work before financial problems forced construction to halt, providing a foundation that could support relatively quick completion. Jennifer's familiarity with both properties suggested that Pacific Northwest Bank had been monitoring potential development opportunities for some time, waiting for the right partner to support projects that exceeded their traditional lending comfort zone. Their preparation indicated serious commitment to establishing a development partnership rather than casual interest in our capabilities. The bank's proposal, presented during our second day of meetings, structured a relationship that would provide mutual benefits while allowing both organizations to build expertise gradually. Pacific Northwest Bank would provide construction financing for Oregon projects, while our company would contribute development expertise and project management capability. The partnership would begin with 2 pilot projects: the Beaverton Shopping Center conversion and completion of the Lake Oswego residential development. Success with these initial ventures would establish credibility for larger projects while allowing both organizations to refine their collaboration processes. Financial terms were structured to share both risks and rewards equitably. The bank would provide construction financing at competitive rates, while our company would contribute development expertise and project management for equity participation in completed projects. Both organizations would benefit from successful projects while limiting exposure if market conditions changed unexpectedly. Jennifer's timeline for implementing the partnership reflected urgency driven by Oregon's rapid growth and the competitive advantage that early market entry could provide. She suggested beginning with property acquisitions within 60 days, allowing construction to commence before winter weather complicated outdoor work. My acceptance of Pacific Northwest Bank's partnership offer marked a milestone that had been 5 years in the making. Returning to Oregon as an equal partner with an established financial institution represented vindication that exceeded my original expectations when I'd left the state as a devastated and inexperienced refugee from family betrayal. The logistics of expanding our business into Oregon required careful planning to avoid disrupting our successful Colorado operations while establishing credibility in a new market. David Kim's legal expertise would be crucial for navigating Oregon's regulatory requirements, while Carmen Rodriguez's administrative skills would support managing projects in 2 states simultaneously. Robert's enthusiasm about our Oregon expansion reflected his confidence in our business model and his pride in watching me develop capabilities that now exceeded his own expertise in many areas. His health had improved sufficiently to allow occasional travel, and he expressed interest in visiting Oregon to see the projects that would launch our multi-state operation. The team expansion required for Oregon operations included hiring local contractors, establishing relationships with municipal officials, and identifying potential tenants for our planned project. The process would test everything we'd learned about entering new markets while maintaining the quality standards that had built our reputation. Marcus Webb's electrical contracting business had grown alongside our development company, and his willingness to establish Oregon operations provided construction expertise that would be invaluable for our initial project. His knowledge of our quality standards and working relationships with our team would ensure continuity between our Colorado and Oregon operations. The Beaverton property acquisition closed in November, providing our first Oregon asset and immediate validation of our partnership with Pacific Northwest Bank. The transaction proceeded smoothly, with Jennifer's team handling local regulatory requirements while our company managed due diligence and renovation plan. Construction began immediately after closing, with Marcus supervising electrical work while local contractors handled plumbing, carpentry, and other specialized trades. The renovation timeline was aggressive, targeting completion by spring to capture peak leasing season for office space and retail tenants. The Lake Oswego residential project required different contractors and a more complex approval process due to neighborhood concerns about construction. Jennifer's relationships with local officials proved invaluable for navigating regulatory requirements while addressing community concerns about project completion. My first 3 months of regular travel between Denver and Portland established routines that would sustain our multi-state operations. Weekly trips to Oregon allowed direct oversight of construction progress while maintaining involvement in our Colorado projects and lending operations. The personal aspects of returning to Oregon were more complex than the business consideration. I deliberately avoided contact with anyone from my previous life, including Claire, who still lived in Portland, focusing exclusively on professional objectives while postponing emotional reckonings that might complicate business decisions. Jennifer's invitations to Portland business and social events provided networking opportunities that were crucial for establishing credibility in Oregon's development community. These gatherings included developers, contractors, municipal officials, and business leaders who could provide insights about market conditions and potential future partnerships. The social events also represented my first exposure to Portland's current business community, which had changed dramatically during my absence. Many attendees were transplants from California or other states, creating a dynamic environment that was simultaneously familiar and completely different from the Portland I'd known. At one particularly significant networking event hosted by the Portland Development Commission, I encountered several people who recognized my name and expressed surprise about my return to Oregon. Their questions about my business background and development experience were purely professional, reflecting genuine interest rather than personal curiosity about my family circumstance. The conversation that would change everything began innocuously during a reception at the Portland Art Museum, celebrating the opening of a new gallery wing. Jennifer had invited me to attend as her guest, mentioning that several potential clients and partners would be present. The event attracted Portland's business elite, creating an ideal environment for establishing professional relationships. I was discussing our Beaverton renovation project with a group of architects and contractors when I noticed a familiar figure across the room. Ryan stood near the museum's information desk, apparently studying a floor plan while waiting for someone. He looked older than I'd expected, with gray hair and the kind of expensive casual clothing that suggested financial success despite the struggles I'd heard about his business. My first instinct was to leave immediately, avoiding any possibility of an encounter that might create awkwardness for Jennifer or complications for our business relationship. But something about Ryan's presence at an event, celebrating arts and culture, struck me as odd, given his previous dismissal of creative pursuits as impractical compared to more business-oriented activities. Victoria appeared beside Ryan, confirming that they were attending the event together. She looked much as I remembered, though her clothing and jewelry suggested that their financial situation had recovered from whatever difficulties had affected their law firm. Their conversation with museum staff appeared cordial, suggesting they were donors or supporters rather than casual attendees. Jennifer noticed my distraction and asked if I was feeling well. I explained that I'd recognized someone from my past and was uncertain about whether to approach them or maintain distance. Her response reflected the kind of practical wisdom that had made her successful in banking, suggesting that acknowledging their presence briefly would be less awkward than obviously avoiding them. My approach to Ryan and Victoria was motivated by curiosity rather than confrontation. 5 years of building a successful business had given me confidence that made family drama seem less significant than it had once appeared. I was genuinely interested in learning about their current circumstances without feeling threatened by whatever they might think about my return to Oregon. Ryan's reaction to seeing me was complex, cycling through surprise, confusion, and what appeared to be genuine pleasure at our unexpected reunion. His greeting was warm, expressing amazement at my presence and asking about my life since leaving Oregon. Victoria's response was more reserved, polite, but clearly uncertain about how to navigate the encounter. Their questions about my current circumstances provided an opportunity to mention my business partnership with Pacific Northwest Bank, without appearing to boast about my success. I described our development projects in general terms, emphasizing the collaborative nature of our work rather than the financial aspects that might seem designed to impress them. Ryan's interest in my business activities appeared genuine rather than merely polite. His questions about real estate development, construction management, and commercial lending suggested knowledge that went beyond casual curiosity. Victoria's contributions to the conversation revealed that she'd maintained her legal practice despite the difficulties that had affected their joint venture. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, covering topics that ranged from Oregon's economic growth to shared memories of our father and the vineyard. Ryan's references to Dad were respectful and nostalgic, showing none of the calculating attitude I'd witnessed during Dad's illness. Victoria's mentions of the vineyard were brief, but suggested that the property remained important to their lives. My questions about the vineyard's current status elicited responses that revealed more than Ryan probably intended. The property was indeed successful, generating revenue that supported their lifestyle, while requiring management attention that limited Ryan's availability for other business activity. Victoria's law practice had become their primary source of income, with the vineyard serving as a valuable but demanding secondary enterprise. The revelation that Ryan had become financially dependent on Victoria's legal work rather than building the development empire he'd envisioned struck me as ironic, but not particularly satisfying. Their current situation appeared stable rather than desperate, suggesting that whatever financial difficulties they'd experienced had been temporary rather than catastrophic. Ryan's invitation to visit the vineyard came near the end of our conversation, offered with apparent sincerity rather than obligation. He mentioned that many of the improvements he'd made would be interesting to someone with my development background, and that Dad's memory would be honored by having both of his children back on the property he'd loved. My acceptance of Ryan's invitation surprised me almost as much as it obviously surprised him. The decision felt spontaneous rather than calculated, driven by curiosity about what had become of Dad's life work rather than any desire to reopen old wounds or create family drama. Jennifer's observation after Ryan and Victoria had left was characteristically perceptive. She noted that the encounter had appeared cordial despite whatever history might have existed between us, and that my composure throughout the conversation suggested personal growth that would serve me well in business situations requiring diplomatic skill. The following week's visit to Harper Family Vineyard represented my first return to the property since Dad's death. The landscape looked much as I remembered, with winter vines arranged in precise rows that had been Dad's pride. The building showed signs of renovation and expansion that reflected Ryan's vision for transforming the operation into something more commercially oriented. Ryan's tour of the vineyard began with the production facilities, where he'd invested in modern equipment that increased efficiency while maintaining quality standards. His explanations of the improvements demonstrated knowledge that had clearly been acquired through experience rather than theoretical study, suggesting that managing the vineyard had provided education that complemented his real estate background. The tasting room had been expanded and modernized, with interior design that emphasized luxury and sophistication rather than the rustic charm that had characterized Dad's approach. The changes were professionally executed and clearly appealed to visitors seeking upscale experiences, though they felt disconnected from the agricultural authenticity that had originally distinguished the vineyard. Victoria's contributions to the vineyard operation included marketing expertise that had expanded distribution beyond Oregon to restaurants and retailers in neighboring states. Her legal background had also proved valuable for navigating regulations and contracts that governed wine production and distribution. Ryan's questions about my impressions of the vineyard improvements revealed both pride in what he'd accomplished and uncertainty about whether his changes honored Dad's legacy appropriately. His comments suggested that success had been harder to achieve than he'd anticipated, requiring compromises and sacrifices that had tested his confidence in the decisions he'd made. The most significant revelation came during our discussion of the vineyard's financial performance. Ryan mentioned that recent years had been challenging due to increased competition, rising costs, and regulatory requirements that had complicated operations. The property was profitable but required constant attention that limited his ability to pursue the real estate development projects he'd originally envisioned. Victoria's legal practice had become essential for maintaining their lifestyle, with the vineyard providing supplemental income rather than the primary revenue source. Ryan had expected their current situation represented success, but not the kind of independence and prosperity that had motivated Ryan's original plans for the property. My questions about their future plans elicited responses that revealed uncertainty about long-term objectives. Ryan expressed interest in eventually returning to real estate development, while Victoria mentioned the possibility of expanding her legal practice to include more commercial clients. Neither seemed entirely satisfied with their current circumstances, despite their apparent financial stability. The conversation's tone shifted when Ryan asked about my business plans and whether I intended to remain in Oregon permanently. My explanation of our development projects and partnership with Pacific Northwest Bank clearly impressed him, though he attempted to hide his surprise at the scope of what I'd accomplished. Ryan's follow-up questions about our company's growth trajectory and expansion plans revealed knowledge of real estate development that exceeded what I'd expected. His comments suggested that he'd been following commercial real estate news and understood the significance of our partnership with an established Oregon bank. The meeting concluded with Ryan's unexpected proposition that we might find opportunities for business collaboration, given our complementary expertise and his knowledge of Oregon's regulatory environment. His suggestion that combining our development capabilities with his local connections could benefit both our businesses was presented tentatively, as though he was uncertain about how I might respond. My response was non-committal but not dismissive, acknowledging that business opportunities should be evaluated based on merit rather than personal history. I agreed to consider any specific proposals he might develop while emphasizing that our company's growth strategy was focused on projects that aligned with our established capability. The drive back to Portland after visiting the vineyard provided time to process emotions that had been more complex than I'd anticipated. Seeing Dad's property under Ryan's management had been less painful than expected, partly because his improvements demonstrated respect for what Dad had built rather than wholesale abandonment of his vision. Ryan's apparent financial dependence on Victoria's legal practice had provided a different kind of satisfaction than I'd expected. Rather than feeling vindicated by his struggles, I found myself appreciating the irony that success had required him to rely on exactly the kind of professional partnership that he'd dismissed as impractical when he'd convinced Dad to change the will. The possibility of future business collaboration with Ryan represented an opportunity that I hadn't anticipated when accepting Jennifer's invitation to return to Oregon. The decision about whether to pursue such partnerships would require careful consideration of both business benefits and personal implications that could affect my focus on our company's growth objective. Jennifer's reaction when I mentioned the vineyard visit and Ryan's business proposition was characteristically practical. She suggested that family relationships could complicate business decisions, but also create opportunities that might not be available with unrelated partners. Her recommendation was to evaluate any specific proposals based on their business merit, while maintaining clear boundaries between personal and professional consideration. The Oregon expansion was proceeding ahead of schedule, with both the Beaverton and Lake Oswego projects attracting tenant interest that validated our market analysis. The success was generating additional opportunities that would require decisions about how aggressively to pursue growth in Oregon versus maintaining focus on our Colorado operation. My personal satisfaction with returning to Oregon as a successful businesswoman rather than a victim of family betrayal had exceeded my expectations. The encounter with Ryan had provided closure that I hadn't realized I needed, demonstrating that his choices 5 years earlier had ultimately launched me toward achievements that would have been impossible if I'd remained in Oregon managing Dad's vineyard. The question of what to do next was more complex than I'd anticipated. Business opportunities in Oregon appeared promising, but accepting them would require permanent relocation and potentially complicated relationships with family members whose motivations I still wasn't certain I understood completely. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 months after my return to Oregon. I was reviewing construction progress reports for our Lake Oswego project when Jennifer Walsh's voice carried an urgency that immediately commanded my attention. Pacific Northwest Bank had received an interesting opportunity that she wanted to discuss in person rather than over the phone. Her request for an immediate meeting was unusual, given our typically scheduled weekly reviews of ongoing projects. The urgency suggested either a significant problem with one of our developments, or an opportunity that required quick decision-making. I cleared my afternoon schedule and drove to the bank's headquarters, wondering what could have prompted such an unexpected summit. Jennifer's office door was closed when I arrived, with her assistant explaining that she was completing a confidential phone call before our meeting. The 20-minute wait provided time to speculate about possibilities, ranging from regulatory issues with our current projects to potential partnerships with other developers seeking our expertise. When Jennifer finally emerged, her expression was carefully neutral in the way that banking executives perfect for delivering news that could be either extraordinarily good or devastatingly bad. She invited me into her office with unusual formality, suggesting that whatever she needed to discuss would have significant implications for our business relationship. The documents Jennifer spread across her desk were immediately recognizable as loan application materials, though the borrower's identity wasn't visible from where I sat. Her explanation began with background about Pacific Northwest Bank's commercial lending portfolio and their recent policy changes regarding risk assessment for existing clients. The bank had been reviewing all commercial loans exceeding certain thresholds, evaluating whether current borrowers continued to meet the creditworthiness standards that had justified their original approvals. Several loans had been identified for potential restructuring or acceleration, depending on the borrower's ability to demonstrate improved financial stability. Jennifer's presentation continued with general discussion about the real estate market's volatility and the challenges facing developers who had relied on optimistic projections during the application process. Economic conditions had changed since many loans were approved, creating situations where borrowers might struggle to meet original repayment terms. The specific opportunity that had prompted our meeting involved a commercial loan that was approaching maturity, with a borrower who was having difficulty securing refinancing from other sources. The property securing the loan was potentially valuable, but the borrower's financial situation had deteriorated since the original loan approval. Jennifer's explanation remained abstract until she mentioned that the borrower was someone I knew personally, and that the bank's board had specifically requested my input about whether to extend the loan terms or pursue foreclosure proceedings. The property in question was Harper Family Vineyard, and the borrower was my brother Ryan. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, despite the logical progression of Jennifer's presentation that should have prepared me for this possibility. Ryan's financial difficulties had apparently become severe enough to jeopardize his ownership of the vineyard that had caused our family's original division. Jennifer's summary of Ryan's financial situation was professionally delivered, but devastating in its implication. The vineyard had been pledged as collateral for a substantial loan that Ryan had obtained 3 years earlier to fund expansion projects and working capital needs. The loan had been approved based on property valuations and income projections that subsequent market conditions had failed to support. Recent assessments indicated that the vineyard's current value was insufficient to fully secure the outstanding loan balance, particularly given declining wine industry conditions and increased competition from other Oregon producers. Ryan's personal financial statements showed heavy dependence on Victoria's legal practice, which had also experienced revenue declines due to economic uncertainty. Pacific Northwest Bank's lending committee had initially recommended proceeding with foreclosure proceedings, given Ryan's apparent inability to service the debt according to original terms. However, the bank's board had requested additional analysis, given the property's historical significance and the potential for alternative resolution strategies. Jennifer's explanation of why the bank had specifically sought my input was carefully worded but clear in its implication. My knowledge of the vineyard's operational requirements, combined with my development expertise and established relationship with the bank, made me uniquely qualified to assess whether the property could be successfully managed under different ownership structure. The bank's preference was to avoid foreclosure if possible, given the negative publicity that could result from seizing a family farm with local historical significance. However, their fiduciary responsibilities to depositors and shareholders required protecting the bank's interests if Ryan couldn't demonstrate realistic prospects for repaying the loan. Jennifer's proposal was elegantly simple and devastatingly ironic. Our development company could potentially acquire the vineyard through a discounted purchase that would allow Ryan to avoid foreclosure while providing the bank with full loan recovery. The transaction would be structured as a voluntary sale rather than forced foreclosure, preserving dignity for all parties while achieving necessary financial objectives. The vineyard's acquisition would complement our existing portfolio by diversifying into agricultural real estate, potentially creating opportunities for agritourism development that could leverage our hospitality and mixed-use expertise. The property's location and established reputation could support event hosting, vacation rentals, and other revenue streams that would justify the investment. My initial response was to decline involvement in any transaction that would result in Ryan losing the vineyard, regardless of the business merits that Jennifer had outlined. The situation felt too much like orchestrated revenge, even though I had no involvement in creating Ryan's financial difficulties or the bank's decision to consider foreclosure. Jennifer's response to my concerns was characteristically thoughtful and persuasive. She emphasized that Ryan's financial problems were entirely self-created, resulting from overextension and poor business decisions, rather than external factors beyond his control. The bank's willingness to consider alternatives to foreclosure represented more consideration than most borrowers in similar situations would receive. The alternative to our involvement would likely be foreclosure proceedings, followed by public auction, where the vineyard would be sold to whoever submitted the highest bid, without regard for preserving its character or protecting existing employees. Our acquisition would ensure continuity of operations while providing opportunities for improvements that could honor Dad's legacy more effectively than Ryan's struggling management. Jennifer's timeline for making a decision was driven by regulatory requirements and Ryan's approaching deadline for proposing alternative arrangements. The bank needed commitment within 2 weeks to avoid initiating foreclosure proceedings that would become public record and potentially damage both Ryan's reputation and the vineyard's market value. My request for time to consider the proposal was granted with understanding, but also with emphasis on the limited window available for reaching a decision. Jennifer offered to provide additional financial information about the vineyard's current operations and projections for future performance under different management scenarios. The drive back to my hotel after meeting with Jennifer provided time to process implications that extended far beyond simple business consideration. Acquiring the vineyard would represent ultimate vindication for the betrayal I'd experienced 5 years earlier, but it would also force me to decide whether revenge was worth the personal and professional complications that would inevitably result. David Kim's reaction when I called to discuss the situation was immediate and pragmatic. He pointed out that the vineyard acquisition would be an excellent business opportunity regardless of family dynamics, and that my personal history with the property actually enhanced my qualifications for managing its success. His legal perspective emphasized that Ryan's financial difficulties were entirely self-created, resulting from decisions made with full knowledge of the risks involved. The bank's offer to facilitate a voluntary sale represented more consideration than Ryan could expect from other potential buyers, particularly given the property's uncertain profitability under current management. Carmen Rodriguez's response was more emotional, reflecting her understanding of the personal dimensions that complicated what should have been straightforward business analysis. She expressed concern about the psychological impact of owning the property that had been stolen from me, questioning whether the acquisition would provide satisfaction or perpetuate painful memories. Robert Chen's advice when I called to discuss the situation was characteristically wise and nuanced. He reminded me that successful business decisions required separating personal emotions from financial analysis, but also acknowledged that some opportunities carried costs that couldn't be measured in purely monetary terms. His recommendation was to evaluate the vineyard acquisition based on its merits as an investment while honestly assessing whether owning the property would enhance or complicate my personal happiness. Robert emphasized that wealth without peace of mind was a poor bargain regardless of the potential financial returns involved. The decision to proceed with the vineyard acquisition came after 3 sleepless nights of weighing considerations that ranged from practical business analysis to philosophical questions about justice, forgiveness, and the nature of success. My final conclusion was that acquiring the vineyard would honor Dad's memory more effectively than allowing it to be sold to strangers who had no connection to its history. Jennifer's reaction to my decision was professionally pleased, but personally sympathetic to the emotional complexity of the situation. She promised to structure the transaction in ways that would minimize public attention while ensuring that Ryan received fair treatment throughout the process. The next phase required direct communication with Ryan to explain the bank's situation and explore whether a voluntary sale could be arranged before foreclosure proceedings became necessary. Jennifer suggested that I initiate this conversation given our family relationship and my understanding of both the business and personal dimensions involved. Ryan's response to my phone call was initially confused, then increasingly desperate as he realized the implications of what I was describing. His questions about the bank's decision-making process revealed that he'd been hoping for loan extensions that were no longer possible given his deteriorating financial condition. The meeting we arranged at the vineyard took place on a gray April afternoon that seemed appropriate for discussing the end of Ryan's ownership of the property that had divided our family. He looked older and more worn than during our previous encounter, showing the stress of financial uncertainty and the prospect of losing everything he'd worked to build. Ryan's explanation of his financial difficulties was lengthy and detailed, covering market conditions, regulatory changes, and personal expenses that had combined to create an impossible situation. His analysis was thorough but ultimately irrelevant to the basic reality that he couldn't service the debt that had been secured by the vineyard. Victoria's absence from our meeting was explained by Ryan as her need to focus on legal clients who might provide emergency income to address their debt obligation. Her law practice had apparently become their sole source of reliable revenue, with the vineyard now representing a drain on resources rather than a contributor to their financial stability. The irony of Ryan's situation wasn't lost on either of them. The vineyard that he'd manipulated Dad into leaving him had become a burden that threatened to destroy the financial security he'd sacrificed family relationships to achieve. His success in obtaining the inheritance had ultimately led to consequences that were far worse than the equal division Dad had originally planned. My offer to purchase the vineyard at a price that would satisfy the bank loan while providing Ryan with a small amount of additional cash was presented as a business proposition rather than family assistance. The terms were generous enough to allow him to avoid bankruptcy while establishing clear boundaries about our future relationship. Ryan's acceptance of the offer was immediate and grateful, though tinged with the obvious irony that he was selling the vineyard to the sister he'd cheated out of her inheritance. His expressions of regret about our family's history were sincere but carefully limited, avoiding admissions that might complicate the transaction or create legal complications. The legal process of acquiring the vineyard proceeded smoothly, with David Kim handling the complex documentation required to satisfy the bank's requirements while protecting our interests. The transaction was structured as a private sale that avoided public foreclosure proceedings, preserving Ryan's reputation while achieving our business objective. Jennifer's management of the bank's role in the transaction was professionally exemplary, ensuring that all parties' interests were protected while maintaining the confidentiality that made the voluntary sale possible. Her satisfaction with the outcome was evident in her comments about the bank's success in recovering their loan while supporting a local business transition. The vineyard acquisition was completed in May, exactly 5 years after I'd left Oregon as a devastated victim of family betrayal. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me, though the satisfaction was more complex than I'd expected. Owning the vineyard felt like justice rather than revenge, representing restoration of what should have been mine originally. Ryan's departure from the vineyard was handled with dignity that reflected the complicated nature of our relationship. He provided comprehensive information about ongoing operations, employee relationships, and supplier contracts that demonstrated his genuine care for the business despite his financial failure. The vineyard's employees responded to the ownership change with cautious optimism, recognizing that my development expertise might provide opportunities for improvements that could enhance both their job security and the property's long-term prospects. Their knowledge of the operation would be invaluable for maintaining continuity during the transition period. My first board meeting as the vineyard's owner included Jennifer, David, Carmen, and Marcus, creating a team that combined banking expertise, legal knowledge, administrative skills, and construction experience. The diversity of perspectives would be essential for developing strategies that honored the vineyard's agricultural traditions while incorporating modern business practices. The renovation plans we developed focused on preserving the vineyard's essential character while adding amenities that could attract visitors and generate revenue streams beyond wine sales. The improvements would include event facilities, guest accommodations, and educational programs that would position the vineyard as a destination rather than just a producer. Marcus's construction expertise was particularly valuable for planning renovations that would meet modern safety and accessibility standards while maintaining the rustic authenticity that visitors expected from a family winery. His understanding of our quality standards would ensure that improvements enhanced rather than compromised the property's appeal. The vineyard's first harvest under my ownership exceeded production expectations, generating revenue that validated our investment while providing confidence about future profitability. The wine quality maintained Dad's standards while benefiting from equipment improvements that Ryan had made during his ownership period. Ryan's subsequent career path included a position with a Portland real estate development firm where his vineyard management experience proved valuable for agricultural and hospitality projects. His work was competent and professional, though he avoided situations that might require direct interaction with our business operation. Victoria's legal practice had stabilized after the vineyard sale relieved their debt obligations, allowing her to focus on clients and cases that matched her interests rather than accepting work purely for financial necessity. Her professional reputation had survived their financial difficulties, providing a foundation for rebuilding their lifestyle. The first anniversary of owning the vineyard was celebrated with a harvest festival that attracted over 500 visitors, generating revenue that exceeded our projections while demonstrating the property's potential as an event destination. The success validated our investment strategy while honoring Dad's vision for the vineyard's role in the community. Jennifer's satisfaction with our business partnership was evident in her recommendation of our company to other banks seeking experienced developers for complex projects. The relationship had evolved beyond simple vendor-client arrangements to genuine strategic partnership that benefited both organizations. The vineyard acquisition had been completed for 18 months when I received a phone call that would provide the final chapter in my family's story. Ryan's voice was hesitant but determined as he explained that he wanted to discuss something important that couldn't be handled over the phone. Our meeting took place at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, neutral territory that felt appropriate for what he described as a personal rather than business conversation. Ryan looked healthier than he had during our previous meetings, suggesting that the stress of financial uncertainty had been replaced by acceptance of his changed circumstance. Ryan's purpose for requesting the meeting was to express genuine remorse for the manipulation that had caused our family's division. His apologies were specific and detailed, acknowledging actions that had been calculated rather than impulsive. He asked for forgiveness without expecting it, recognizing that his choices had consequences that couldn't be undone. The conversation revealed that Ryan had been in therapy to address issues related to his relationship with Dad and his treatment of family members. His therapist had recommended making amends to people he'd harmed, not to benefit himself but to acknowledge the reality of what he'd done. Ryan's explanation of his motivations during Dad's illness was more complex than simple greed. He described feeling overlooked and undervalued throughout his childhood, believing that Dad favored me and that the vineyard represented his only opportunity to prove his worth. His manipulation of Dad had been driven by desperation rather than confidence. The therapy had helped Ryan understand that his feelings of inadequacy had been largely self-created, resulting from comparisons and competitions that existed primarily in his own mind. Dad's love for both of us had been genuine, though expressed differently based on our individual personalities and interests. My response to Ryan's apology was acceptance rather than forgiveness, acknowledging his courage in addressing our history while maintaining boundaries about our future relationship. I expressed appreciation for his honesty without committing to rebuilding the family connections that his choices had destroyed. The meeting concluded with Ryan's observation that the vineyard appeared to be thriving under my ownership in ways that it never had under his management. His acknowledgement that Dad would have been proud of what I'd accomplished carried weight that his earlier apologies had lacked. The drive back to the vineyard, after meeting with Ryan, provided time to reflect on the journey that had begun with devastating betrayal and concluded with successful restoration of what should have been mine originally. The satisfaction was profound but also peaceful, representing closure rather than ongoing conflict. Claire's visit to the vineyard later that month marked the restoration of our friendship after years of limited contact. Her amazement at what I'd accomplished professionally was matched by her observation that I seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Dad's death. The vineyard's success continued to exceed projections, generating revenue that supported not only profitable operations but also improvements that enhanced both employee working conditions and visitor experience. The business had become everything Dad had envisioned while incorporating innovations that reflected modern hospitality expectations. Robert Chen's visit to Oregon provided an opportunity to show him the vineyard that had become the unexpected crown jewel of our real estate portfolio. His pride in my accomplishments was evident in his comments about the transformation from bitter family dispute to successful business operation. The final irony of my story became clear during the vineyard's third harvest festival under my ownership. Ryan attended as a regular visitor, purchasing wine and enjoying the festivities like any other guest. His presence was comfortable rather than awkward, reflecting the peace that had replaced the anger that had driven me to succeed. The little girl who had once helped Dad tend the vines had become a successful businesswoman who owned not just the vineyard but also the satisfaction of having built something meaningful from devastating betrayal. Ryan's face when he realized that his theft had ultimately launched me toward achievements that exceeded anything he'd ever imagined was indeed priceless, though the expression I remembered most clearly was his genuine happiness about what I'd accomplished. The vineyard's success represented more than financial achievement. It proved that Dad's trust in my capabilities had been justified, even if he'd been manipulated into withdrawing it temporarily. The property was thriving under management that honored his vision while incorporating improvements that he would have appreciated. My story had come full circle, from devastating loss to triumphant recovery, but the journey had taught me that success without peace was meaningless. Owning the vineyard was satisfying, but finding peace with the past was the real victory that made all the other achievements worthwhile. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.